Board of Inquiry into the Hazelwood mine fire is now in session.
Professor Kemp.
Good morning. We begin today the second week of the hearings for the Hazelwood mine fire inquiry. The first week focused on the origins and responses to the fire in the mine. We also considered the health aspects of the firefighters. Justice Bernie T, Ms. Sonia Pettering and I are pleased that the proceedings in the first week were conducted efficiently, effectively and respectfully, given the complexity of the issues covered, the very extensive sets of information and the interests of the respective parties. We thank you for your cooperation and look to the good start continuing. This week we move to the open cut mine, from the open cut mine to the community of Morwell and surrounding districts. We will consider the environmental, health and social impacts and the responses to these, including efforts to engage with the community, provide information and offer assistance during and after the fire. We have learned from the extensive community consultations and stakeholder meetings in April and May, and from submissions from the general public, that the environmental, health and social impacts were severe and lasted many weeks, and for some people continue to do so. Many concerns were raised about the timeliness and appropriateness of the responses from relevant agencies, the coordination between them and the form that the communications took. We intend to understand these issues more clearly with an open mind through the statements of key individuals from the principal organisations, from members of the public and from experts that the inquiry has engaged. The overriding purpose will be to learn from the events that occurred and look forward in terms of developing better policies, procedures, programmes, as well as building stronger capacities and capabilities. A futures orientation to our discussions is vital if we are to manage similar or related events more effectively. Chairman.
The first witness this week is John Merritt, who was the Chief Executive Officer of the Environment Protection Authority throughout the fire. Mr. Merritt, could you come forward, please?
Please state your full name.
John Damien Merritt.
Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
To this Board of Inquiry.
To this Board of Inquiry.
Will be the truth.
Will be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Mr. Merritt.
Good morning.
I'll start by asking you to state again your full name and your address.
John Damien Merritt.
And you are, I think now, nearing your first month anniversary of being the Chief Executive Officer of Vic Roads.
That's correct.
But you were in February and March this year the Chief Executive Officer of the Environment Protection Authority.
That's correct.
And it's in that capacity that you're here today.
Yes.
Mr. Merritt, you've made a statement in this proceeding, or to this inquiry. You should have a copy of it there in front of you. Are there any corrections that you would like to make to the statement? I understand there was a particular issue with paragraph 111, but there may be some other.
Are you referring to the data analysis and monitoring strategy documents that we've subsequently tabled?
That's right.
Yes, I understand that we've indicated prior to today that we have tabled additional or updated standards to make a complete set of those strategy documents, and that accordingly the references on those have been amended to make them accurate as well.
All right, so the inquiry's been provided with the substitute paragraph 111 and
Yes.
a fresh set of references, perhaps to line up the documents referred to more clearly with what's actually produced. Apart from that correction, are there any other corrections you'd like to make?
No.
Is your statement true and correct?
Yes.
I tender that, if I could. Mr. Merritt, can I start by asking you a little bit more about your own background? On your form this year, it might be safe to describe your occupation as Chief Executive Officer. But you were at the EPA for about 4 years.
That's right.
In the role of Chief Executive Officer for the entire time.
Yes, I was.
And prior to that, you were at the Victorian Work Cover Authority.
That's right. I was the Executive Director of Health and Safety in the Work Cover Authority.
All right. And how long were you there?
8 years.
8 years. And was that the entire period of your employment at Work Cover?
Yes.
And before that?
I was the Chief Executive of the National Safety Council of Australia for 3 years.
And you tell us in your statement that your formal qualification is a Bachelor of Economics.
That's right.
And I take it from the brief outline of your career that you've given us that you have developed particular expertise in managing public sector agencies.
Look, since 2001, I've been in senior leadership roles in public agencies, yes.
Right. All right. So your role at the EPA was very much that of a manager rather than as a scientist?
That's correct,
yes.
Yes, I was Chief Executive and therefore responsible for supporting the scientists to do their work.
Right. All right. So we do have Dr. Is it Torre? Is that how it's
Torre?
Torre, giving evidence tomorrow. And if at any point the questions that I ask you are more appropriately answered by him, please do say so. You've provided us with a good deal of detail in the statement about the role and responsibility of the EPA, but I just wondered if you could talk about it a bit. What is the EPA's overall role in relation to environment protection?
Well, the EPA is Victoria's environmental regulator. It's our responsibility to, primarily through its licensing or permissioning regime, to set emission limits or pollution limits on a range of major businesses throughout the state. We licence in the order of 700 facilities, and they're the major industrial facilities of the state that can impact on the environment. In addition to that, it's the job of the EPA to monitor the environment in terms of air quality, water quality, both marine and fresh water.
All right. Now, we did ask you to provide an explanation of the EPA's organisational structure, and you've attached to your statement something called a basic organisational chart that I confess defeated me. There's a rather simpler organisation chart that's attached or that's provided on your website. I'll just ask for a copy of that to be brought up and provided to the parties and the board. And this puts on one page what is provided in rather more detail in, I think it's attachment 6 to your statement. So we see from this that the role of CEO, I take it that that's currently the subject of a recruitment process.
Yes.
And you work with an advisory board that's chaired by Cheryl Battergold.
Cheryl's the chairman of the
Yes.
organisation. Under the Act, there's an advisory board that reports to her, yes.
Right. And also the Minister for Environment and Climate Change is oversees the organisation.
Yes.
And then there are 3 what I might describe as operational divisions: environment regulation, strategy and support, and knowledge standards and assessment. Now, just to be clear where the various people you refer to in the early paragraphs of your statement fit, Chris Webb heads up environmental regulation.
That's correct.
And he was the EPA's representative on the State Emergency Management Team.
Predominantly, yes.
Predominantly. Did someone depute for him various stages?
Well, we because of the duration of the event, two of our directors were offline supporting through that role. Annie Bolkering was also from time to time relieving in that capacity.
Okay.
And when neither of them was available, another senior officer might be present at the State Emergency Management Team meeting.
And then you talk about incident commanders who were appointed, Elizabeth Radcliffe and Tim Bessel-Brown. Where do they fit within this structure?
They were both under the Environmental Regulation Team.
Okay. And Dr Torre?
He's part of the Monitoring and Assessment Team. That's part of the Knowledge, Standards and Assessment Division.
Okay. Thank you. If I could ask that this document be included as part of Attachment 6 to this exhibit. Next, I'd like to move to the EPA's role in emergency management. And you deal with this at paragraphs 21 through to 24 of your statement. There's only one kind of emergency in Victoria for which the EPA would be the control agency. Have I understood that correctly?
That's right.
And that's pollution of inland waterways.
That's right.
That's not what we're dealing with here.
No.
The EPA is a support agency in all other emergencies. And you've noted later in your statement that the EPA is not designated as a key support agency in relation to fire events. Have I understood that correctly?
In relation to bushfire events,
Yes.
That's right. Yes.
That's right.
Clearly, we're designated as for the hazmat events, which may well involve fire.
Now, question arises why that is so, why the EPA is not a key support agency for a bushfire, given its role in relation to monitoring and advising the community about air quality standards.
In practice, the EPA has been a support agency in bushfires, more so since 2009, and that in part resulted in the development of the protocol with the Department of Health to guide our work and to establish the advisories that play out there. So whilst it wasn't identified explicitly in the Emergency Management Manual of Victoria, we have played that role in supporting bushfires in recent years.
Well, to put it simply, where there's fire, there's smoke, and where there's smoke, there's usually air quality concerns, depending on the proximity to populated areas. So would you agree that perhaps the Emergency Management Manual should be revised to identify the EPA as a key support agency for bushfire events?
Look, I think there will be an opportunity to review those roles in light of this event, certainly. I think particularly given that, as we saw in the lead up to the 9th of February, where the volume or the sheer number of fires across the state was significant, and we also had the situation where, particularly with the fires in East Gippsland, there were some sustained air quality issues arising from that.
Yes. So is the answer yes?
Yes.
And of course the EPA is a key support agency where there is a hazmat component to an incident.
Yes.
And clearly you can have a fire and a hazmat incident happening at the same time, as we in fact had here.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'd next like to ask you about some observations you make at paragraph 41 and 42 of your statement under the heading Importance of Scientific Rigour in Emergency Situations.
Yes.
The picture that emerges from your statement is that the EPA is an agency that is very much driven by science, but there's an important qualification that you identify in paragraph 42, that in an emergency, perfect data is not always available, and what matters is getting the best indicative data that you can to inform decision making. Have I understood that correctly?
That's right.
So while perfection may not be possible in the early stages of an emergency, it is important to get early data and the best data that you can, and to get that data to the decision makers.
Yes, I was also alluding in that statement to the role that, particularly in air quality, in my experience, the scientists play over and above the data. That data is an input to their professional consideration of the issues, but there are many instances where, in fact, virtually all emergency response issues, where an EPA scientist would be called to assist in a hazmat incident, where their professional advice to the emergency services would be what was required, and there would be no opportunity for data at all. So it's most unusual to have any data in an emergency situation. It's just not practical.
And so sometimes you just have to make a judgment call based on what you can see and what you can smell.
And what you know to be, and not sometimes, but almost every time.
Mm. All right. The EPA has various principles set out in its legislation to guide its decision making, and one of those is the precautionary principle. Does that principle play a role in the EPA's response to an emergency?
Yes, it does. We would always act. We would err on the side of caution when dealing with our advice to the community and or other agencies that we worked with.
Can I just ask you, what do you mean by using caution? And the precautionary principle is actually more about making the best decision for the interests of the community.
The precautionary principle is framed in the Act, and the extrapolation I've articulated is in the context that there are still significant emerging issues and evidence in many of the areas of scientific deliberation that relate to the environment. Again, as a non-scientist, it's been evident in leading the organisation that these are maturing fields. And we may get to some of this later on when we talk about the emerging evidence around fine particles and the impact on populations. And so it's in that context that the Act, if I recall, frames the challenge of the environment around the unknowns and seeks to position decision-making in the context of having incomplete or emerging or maturing evidence. Does that make sense?
So the precautionary principle, as it's articulated in the Environment Protection Act, isn't perhaps directly applicable to the situation we're dealing with here, but it states if there are threats of serious or irreversible environmental damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. And my question to you is whether that's an approach that is adapted to serious or irreversible harm to human health.
Well, again, I think you're, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're pointing to a situation where, again, there's incomplete evidence, perhaps, of what might be and what the responsibility of the EPA under the Act would be in not using that incomplete evidence to not act. And I agree, the absence of the complete picture would not be a basis on which the organisation could not act even in an emergency like this.
All right, now I'd like to move now to standards for air quality, and you deal with these starting at paragraph 69 of your statement. In Victoria, we have two standards that deal with air quality. They're the State Environment Protection Policies, or SEPPs, and one deals with ambient air quality and one deals with air quality management. Now, have I understood correctly that the ambient air quality standard is the one that applies to the air that members of the community generally breathe?
That's how I understand it.
Yes, and the air quality management standard is much more focused on managing emissions.
Yes, I think that's a way of articulating it. Certainly the ambient air standards were the ones most pertinent in this situation.
Now, the State Environment Protection Policy for ambient air quality is based in turn on the National Environment Protection Measure for ambient air quality. And that's a document that was first adopted in 1998, is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
And the focus or the basis for having adopted these standards is very much about human health, as opposed to water standards, which are much more about environmental concerns.
As I understand it, the standards, yes, they reflect the epidemiological studies in relation to health and flow back into the standards in the SEP and the NEPM.
Okay. So you've provided a summary there at Table 1 of the air standard values. Now, carbon monoxide, the standard is, you've given us there 9,000 parts per billion. That's also 9 parts per million, is it not?
That's right.
Which is in fact the way it's expressed in the standard, over an 8-hour period. So that's an average measure over an 8-hour period. And then moving down the table, there are 2 standards for ozone, one over a 1-hour period and one over a 4-hour period. And then you've provided a number of standards for particles, PM 2.5 and PM 10. Now, the State Environment Protection Policy for ambient air quality only sets a standard for PM 10 particles. Have I understood that correctly?
The PM 2.5 standard is referred to as an advisory standard because it has not been affirmed nationally, as I understand it.
All right. Perhaps we can go to the State Environment Protection Policy for ambient air quality, which is attachment 7. And there is a hyperlink at the bottom of paragraph 68. It's the first one. That's right, that one.
So is that...
It should be behind tab 7 in your folder, Mr. Merritt.
That's the whole tab, yes. Are you taking me to paragraph 68, sorry?
No, I'm taking you to the document.
Oh, the document, thank you.
We just are trying to get the document up on the screen as well. All right, and if you could go to page 6, please. And there's a Schedule 2 table there.
Yes.
And it sets out the standards for various measures, including carbon monoxide, photochemical oxidants as ozone, and particles as PM10. There's nothing in that table about PM 2.5. Where do we find the advisory standard expressed?
Actually, I'd rather defer to our scientist about that, rather than complicate the issue. It is, as I said, referred to as an advisory standard, but nevertheless treated as a mainstream standard that we work to.
What's the difference between an advisory standard and a compliance standard?
My understanding is that the advisory standard reflects a failure to achieve national agreement on that level, and so in the interim, and it's adopted as an advisory standard.
But how does that affect the EPA's monitoring and enforcement of that standard?
It does not have a practical effect in our monitoring and reporting against it or the actions that we would take.
Now, it's the case, is it not, that a compliance standard for PM 2.5, so particulates that are a lot smaller than PM 10, PM 2.5 has been under consideration at a national level for well over 10 years.
I believe that's right. Yes.
And really since the National Environment Protection Measure on air quality or ambient air quality was first adopted in the late 1990s.
I'm aware there's been a long-standing discussion around this standard.
Now, those national measures are set by a body called the National Environment Protection Council, is that correct?
That's right.
Which I understand to be an intergovernmental council,
Yes.
a bit like a COAG but of environment ministers.
It's an adjunct to the Ministerial Council, yes.
All
It's a
right.
good way of describing it.
How does Victoria participate in that body?
We're a member of that council, as is every state, and the National Environment Council has been conducting further work on air quality issues under the leadership of the council.
All right, so it's a council. Is it a ministerial council or is it heads of environment protection authorities, or is it a mixture of those two?
It's not the heads of the authorities. My understanding is when the Ministerial Council meets, it meets effectively as that council as well.
All right. Now, from my own reading, it would appear that in 2003, the Council adopted the advisory standard for PM 2.5, and there has been discussion since then about raising that to the level of a compliance standard, most recently as last month or the month before, but that no agreement has yet been reached at a national level about the promulgation of a compliance standard for PM 2.5 particles. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, I certainly am aware that there's been no agreement reached as yet about the promulgation of that standard, to uplift it from advisory to affirmed.
Now, we do have a fair body of evidence that's been put before this inquiry to the effect that the adverse health effects of fine particles, in particular PM 2.5, are well known, have been well documented and increasingly well understood. What's the block or the barrier to the development of a compliance standard for PM 2.5 at a national level?
I would articulate the issue as this. There is, I think as you have alluded to, there's a maturing discussion around the health impacts of fine particles. The impediment to the affirmation of the standard has been because the impact of these fine particles on what are called vulnerable communities is such that there may be no safe level, or in the view of some scientists, there may be no safe level of exposure. In other words, even the small quantity of the fine particle could have adverse health effects on vulnerable people. And I understand, and there may be more to it, but as I understand it, it's been that difficulty about the what is taken from striking the standard and the message or implication that might have that anything below that is safe to all communities. And I believe that particular issue has been challenging for the scientists who have been working in this area. And whilst I'm not a scientist and not across the science, that debate has been playing out in the United States and in Europe and indeed most developed countries, particularly those countries who've got bigger issues with urban fine particle emissions.
And yet in the United States there's been a compliance standard in place since the late 1990s, has there not?
And the standard, I think, the level, you might correct me, I think is 30 or 35.
Well, I'm not that concerned about the level of the standard, rather the existence of a standard. They've actually been able to strike a standard and apply it across a federation that's even more complex than our own. So one issue is the lack of scientific agreement about whether there is a safe level and if so what it is. Now what I don't understand is why that should be a barrier to having any standard at all, because at present it is effectively unregulated, is it not?
Look, in practice, I could not say it's unregulated. The advisory standard, I think in answer to your earlier question, is applied by the EPA as if it were the standard. It's the standard against which we report all of our monitoring data, and it's the standard against which we act when we see elevated levels above it in other areas that we monitor.
Which again begs the question, what's the difficulty? If there's no difference between an advisory standard and a compliance standard, what's the difficulty in adopting the current standard as a compliance standard?
I think, as I said earlier, there has been a difficulty in resolving that debate about a standard setting what is seen to be a safe level when there is significant debate that there might not be a safe level. And I go back on your earlier comment about there is significant scientific evidence around fine particles and the impact on health, but it is also, certainly from my position in leading an organisation in this field, a maturing and emerging debate as well. There's quite a lot of conjecture around the impact of this on health and particularly long-term exposure. It's most evident played out obviously in Asian cities where there are very high levels, but also in European cities where, with the significant shift towards diesel vehicles in the last decade or so, most countries in the European Union have struggled to achieve emission levels at or below the standard that's in fact, I don't think any country is achieving ambient air quality that complies with their standard level.
Could I just ask, but there is a compliance standard for PM10. Doesn't the same issues apply to that standard?
Again, I can't comment as a non-scientist other than to say that the work and the research around the larger particles is much more mature. The point I'm making, I think you're quite rightly pointing to the fact that this should have been resolved, and I'm not defending that situation. The point I'm wanting to make, and I won't repeat it, is that in the absence of that being affirmed, we have treated the advisory standard as if it were a mature standard.
So there's a tension, as I understand your evidence, between some scientists who maintain that there's no safe level for vulnerable groups and the difficulty in setting a standard that can't in practice be attained.
The tension is about the message that these standards set. I could talk at length with you about the challenge of using these standards in real-time community applications because we have similar situations in other urban settings in Victoria. But it does go to the debate, which is somewhat circular, is that I think, as you said, there should be a standard. What message then does that standard send to everybody in the community, given that there is a view that the vulnerability of some, the elderly in particular, the young and the asthmatic, obviously specifically, that it might not be safe for them to be exposed to lower levels of fine particles.
Could Victoria set its own compliance standard for PM 2.5 in its state environment protection policy on ambient air quality ahead of the resolution of that issue at a national level?
No.
Why not?
Well, because Victoria, as a part of the National Council, is committed to the principle of national standards for environmental matters.
So that's a commitment given in what form?
Now, I can't point to the specific reference to that commitment other than the principle that there be one set of standards that applies to the country is well entrenched, specifically to stop individual regimes setting different standards that would ultimately cause more harm than good.
Although this is a discussion that's been going on periodically for 10 to 14, possibly longer, years at a national level, it would appear from the evidence that's been put before this inquiry that it is irrefutable that there are adverse health effects from exposure to PM 2.5, particularly for vulnerable groups. And yet, at a national level, there's been no resolution of a compliance standard for PM 2.5. Why could not Victoria lead the way on that issue?
Well, again, I think the principle of national consistency of environmental standards is a good principle. I would not support breaching that. I would make the point again, though, that the advisory nature of that standard has no material impact on the way in which the EPA monitors and takes action.
We'll come to that in a little while, but I do want to help the board understand as best we can what is the block, why is there no standard for PM 2.5? Everyone agrees that they have adverse health effects.
Yes, there is agreement that there is adverse health effect. Again, as I said earlier, there are different views given that there are some in the community, some vulnerable groups in the community who would experience or could experience adverse health effects at levels below the current advisory standard.
Yes.
The debate is, should you have a standard at all?
Yes.
And if so, what should it be? And that debate's not been resolved.
Why not? What's the issue? What's the block? Whose mind has to be changed?
Look, it relates to, ultimately the council will take the advice of the scientists from the different jurisdictions, and they've not been able to achieve a consensus on that issue.
So it's a lack of scientific consensus?
It's about scientific debate, yes.
About whether there is a safe level?
And if so, where it should be set.
Right.
So I think that there is a degree of consensus that the advisory standard should stand as it is, but there has been that reluctance, and you're right, has gone on for some time, about affirming that level, given that my only concession to that impasse relates to my earlier content. Again, not being a scientist, it has been evident to me there's a lot of maturing in the understanding of this field. You've made the point, and I accept, there is no disagreement about the adverse health effects of inhaling fine particles. There's a lot of emerging research, though, as to what that effect is, what level of exposure that effect might be, and this will come out in our debate, no doubt, this morning, and therefore, where the exposure level should be set. This may well come out in discussions with the scientists tomorrow, but it's an emerging field.
I'm still not sure that I understand what the issue is. It's a lack of scientific consensus?
That's how I would paraphrase it, yes.
All right. And yet we have an advisory standard that you're telling us is really no different in practice from a compliance standard.
For the purposes of the environmental regulator, it's treated as an absolute standard, yes.
Okay. So
or a mature
just to
standard.
be clear, when the advisory standard is exceeded, what action can the EPA take?
Well, the examples are we would then seek to find the sources of those emissions and then take action to regulate reductions below them. Similar as we do with the PM10 scenario.
All right, but because it's only an advisory standard, if the source of the emission is not reduced, there's no possibility of taking compliance action. The nature of these emissions, just to illustrate, I'm just relating it to a scenario that I've dealt with elsewhere where we have seen elevated levels of particles. It's also the case that the emerging nature of this issue doesn't see widespread monitoring at this stage of fine particles, unlike the PM10. And I think when the scientists discuss this tomorrow, they will talk about the correlation between PM10 and PM2.5. In other words, one is evidence of the other. Yes.
And so there'll be a basis to act there.
You didn't answer my question, Mr. Merritt. I'm trying to find out from you, what is the difference, practically speaking, between a compliance standard and an advisory standard?
Yes,
there must be a difference, and I'm putting to you that the difference is that if an advisory standard is exceeded, and despite the EPA's best efforts, the source of the emissions is not reduced or eliminated, that the EPA is unable to take compliance action against the emitter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Can I add to it? Because there is the correlation between the fine particle and the larger particle, and there isn't a firm standard there, and the presence of the larger particles would be there. In a practical situation, that would be the basis for action to be taken.
So there may be an opportunity to take enforcement action in relation to PM10 particles.
That's correct.
And as you say, there's a correlation between the two. And then just to close off that area, your response to the suggestion that Victoria might take a leadership position and establish its own compliance standard for PM 2.5 is that you would defer to the commitment to national standards for air quality.
Yeah, I would be opposed to any state going off on its own and setting local environmental standards.
Could I just ask you a comment? About 40 years ago, Victoria broke rank from the rest of the nation and introduced food safety standards, and subsequently the Commonwealth and the other states and territories then adopted in essence the Victorian leadership. Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not, no.
The point here is that there is precedent for leadership in these sorts of areas.
I'd like now to move to how the monitoring is done in practice. And this document that we're looking at, the State Environment Protection Policy for Ambient Air Quality, gives some guidance about the location and number of air monitoring stations or performance monitoring stations. We can look at paragraphs 14 and 15.
What page is that?
Sorry, on page 4.
Yes.
So stations are, according to paragraph 14, to be sited or located in such a manner as that contributes to obtaining a representative measure of air quality for the general population in the region or sub-region. So that the aim there is not necessarily to place a monitor near the worst source of emission. It's to gain a representative sample of the air quality in a particular area.
Yes.
And then in relation to the number of performance monitoring stations, there's a formula that is dependent on population. Can you explain how that works?
No, I defer to the scientists as to how they advise me where the stations should be, I'm sorry.
All right. But we do see that with one exception, performance monitoring stations are in metropolitan Melbourne.
Yes, they are.
And the exception is the permanent monitoring station in Traralgon.
That's correct.
There's then, at the top of the next page, at paragraph 2, a statement that additional performance monitoring stations may be needed where pollutant levels are influenced by local characteristics, such as topography, weather or emission sources. And that would suggest that a performance monitoring station in the Latrobe Valley may well be in accordance with these considerations. Because we have several open-cut coal mines, I think 4 power stations, a number of other major industries, and it's also a valley where emissions can be captured and are. And is that the basis on which we do have a performance monitoring station in the Latrobe Valley?
Yes, historically, for the reasons that you point out, it has significant emissions. It's also a very significant population centre as well.
Although on raw population alone, it may not qualify. For example, there's not one in Ballarat or Bendigo.
No, the other centres, this one obviously has a prima facie case for the need to monitor the air.
All right. Now, can you explain why it is that that Traralgon was chosen as the location for the permanent monitoring station in the Latrobe Valley?
I'll probably best if the scientists explain, but their advice was that reflects, in line with the initial paragraph that you referred to, that gives a reading of the air quality that's likely to be experienced by the general population in the region.
And the Traralgon station, it's been in place there for a number of years, and it measures a number of air quality measures, but not PM 2.5.
No.
Why does it not measure PM 2.5?
All of our air monitoring stations have not been routinely measuring PM 2.5, as I alluded to when we were talking in the earlier discussion. Yes. This is the maturing nature of this science. We've taken a decision in the last 12 months to progressively upgrade the stations to have that capacity. Specifically in relation to Traralgon, we may get to it, but we've been conducting a separate air monitoring program in Morwell, and it found some issues of PM 2.5, which we decided to upgrade the Traralgon station as a result of.
All right, but that upgrade hasn't happened yet, has it?
No. The equipment that we purchased for that, ironically, was the one that we were able to deploy in Morwell East when the fire started.
All right. So do I understand you correctly that at present none of the permanent monitoring stations in Victoria monitor for PM 2.5?
Look, I stand corrected, but I don't think they do. No.
And were there a compliance standard for PM 2.5, we could expect to see that monitoring in place across Victoria, could we not?
Yes, that's true.
Yes.
Ms Richards, could I just clarify, Mr Merritt, who makes the decision about additional performance monitoring stations?
Well, ultimately it would be a decision of the Chief Executive on the advice of our scientists.
Is there a great deal of additional expense involved in upgrading a monitoring station to also monitor for PM 2.5?
Look, I'd have to take that on notice as to what sort of cost is involved in the purchase of that extra equipment, but equipment is always costly and then there's a maintenance regime, but given the in-situ stations, it's a manageable expense, I think we calculate.
Yes, so you already have the infrastructure there. It's a matter of, I'm guessing, installing an additional piece of equipment.
Yes.
Yes.
So I still don't quite understand it. If there's an advisory standard, which you're saying, Mr Merritt, is essentially treated as if it was a compliance standard, why haven't we been monitoring PM 2.5?
Because, as I understand it, we've in those monitoring exercises that we've run, there's been little or no instance of elevated levels of PM 2.5. The decision that we took to upgrade the Traralgon station was based on the 12-month monitoring period that we ran in Morwell East that concluded in May of last year. And it found, I think, and I'll stand corrected, but I believe there were 5 days where the PM2.5 level was exceeded in the 12-month period to May of last year. And those 5 days related to 1 or 2 instances of bushfires and I think 3 days of planned burning. Mm-hmm. And the decision that we took was arising from the Black Saturday recommendations. There will be significantly more planned burning now and into the future. We have a particular challenge around planned burning smoke or bushfire smoke coming out of the ranges across the valley, hitting the coast in certain weather conditions, and that smoke being pushed back. And the readings that we saw in that 12-month period reflected one of those situations where smoke had been trapped in the valley for 2 or 3 days. And both on the monitoring and feedback from residents was that air quality had been quite poor. So what we're trying to do is provide much more evidence to be able to help us work with the Department of Environment and Primary Industries in planning their planned burns and develop progressively more information about the impact of weather patterns and schedule those burns so as to minimise the impact on residents in the valley.
All right. So you've mentioned this study that was done over 12 months from 2012, concluding in May 2013.
Yes.
So what was the purpose of that 12-month study?
In 2011-12, an application was made to the EPA regarding the establishment of a coal burning facility, and in the course of the consideration of that application, there were issues. Our scientists raised concerns around steps that were being taken to mitigate, I think, sulphur dioxide emissions, and the need to go back and assess the emissions of the existing stations, particularly in Morwell, because this particular facility was designed to be located around the briquette works, for want of a better expression. And so the decision was taken that we needed to be satisfied that the licence conditions that were being imposed on the power stations in the valley were adequate to the emissions, particularly, as I recall, particularly in regard to sulphur dioxide. And the decision was taken, once you put an air monitoring station there, let's put everything there and get an accurate read on air quality in Morwell. And
the Traralgon station was not able to provide you with that information?
The advice of the scientists is they wanted to get better evidence on any impact that might be different to what we're seeing in Traralgon that might affect the residents of Morwell.
Right. Because the power stations really are clustered around Morwell, are they not?
Yes. Some of them are.
Yeah.
There's those two there, but of course you've got Luang near Traralgon and Illawong up further near Moe.
Now, how was the location of this additional monitoring station determined? It's near the football ground on Hourigan Road, sort of on the northeast side of town.
It's just up above the Morwell East footy ground.
We
yes.
have a map. So are you able to point out on that map?
It is.
Yeah, there's Hourigan. Yes. All right.
And I suppose for bearings, if you go due south of there is the briquette works and the power station that you're referring to. And just going Kennett Hall, almost due south there.
Between Dairy Street and the Boulevard.
I can't quite read that, Judge, but it's just up. Again, the reference I would use that if you're at the Morwell East football ground, which will be familiar to most people in the town, it is directly north up in the reserve to the north there, up on the slightly to the eastern side.
Okay.
You asked how was the decision made to locate
to site it there rather than closer to the mine.
It's a recommendation of the scientists to get an area that best provides an accurate measure. I think the point that you alluded to earlier in the SEP about getting an area which is representative tends to be a matter for quite a bit of scientific rigour in my experience.
Right, and broadly speaking, what were the findings of that 2012-2013 study?
Look, broadly speaking, there was the finding in regard to those 5 days of 2.5 exceedance, but the broad finding was that the air quality as measured in the Traralgon station was reflective of air quality in the valley, and also that air quality in the valley was generally very good and has improved significantly over the years. It was quite a positive result for the community, I felt.
And the days on which particulate readings were of concern didn't relate to emissions from industry, related to bushfire and planned burning activity around the valley.
Yes.
Now, you met with Council on a couple of occasions last year, did you not, to discuss the study and its findings?
Yes.
And Council have provided us with copies of some notes taken at each of those meetings, one on the 8th of April and one on the 2nd of September. If we could look at the first of those notes. So you're there with Dr. Torra and Ms. Volkering as well.
Yes.
And Dieter Meltzer, who's your Gippsland Regional Manager. Yes. And then there are a number of councillors who are participating in the discussion too. And you may not have seen this document before. No? Would you like to take a moment to read through it and just see whether it reflects your own memory of what was discussed?
You certainly, having read through the first meeting, that's reflective of the discussion.
All right. So there was a view put to you by the councillors that they would like to see more than one air quality monitoring station in the Latrobe Valley.
The specific point that I recall was they didn't want the temporary station to be removed when the 12-month monitoring period had concluded.
Yes. And they put to you that the Latrobe Valley is a special case because, unlike other regional centres, it has a unique industry base, and in particular the open cut coal mines and the power stations. One of the conclusions expressed at the bottom of that second page is that the EPA would review the number of air quality monitoring stations in the Latrobe Valley in recognition that the area has a unique industry profile.
Yes.
And that was a commitment you gave the councillors at that meeting.
Yes.
And you went away and conducted that review, I assume. in the subsequent months.
That's right. That was our subsequent discussions was what led to the upgrading of the Traralgon station to incorporate the fine particle monitoring.
All right. So there's a second set of notes
Yes.
from a meeting on the 2nd of September 2013, which are a little longer.
Okay. Is there something specific in there you wanted to take me to?
To summarise them, much of the meeting was discussing the findings of the 12-month study you'd done.
Yes.
And then right at the very end, the very last dot point, EPA
Yes.
do not see the necessity to install any other air monitoring stations at this stage in the Latrobe Valley. They consider Traralgon to be representative of the area. Can you explain the rationale for that
Yep.
decision?
Yes, the presentation that Dr. Torre gave was able to show the air quality data for the Morwell East station and the air quality data for the Traralgon station and showed that they were comparable. In other words, there was nothing gained by having the additional station in terms of information about air quality in the valley. I think, as I said earlier, the data from Traralgon is representative of the data across the valley. The issue was this impact of planned burning and further fires and wanting to upgrade to make sure that we're able to monitor that better.
Right. So there was a decision to upgrade the Traralgon station to monitor PM 2.5 as well,
Yeah.
that having been identified as an issue in this 12-month study, and that decision hadn't been fully implemented by the time the fires burned in the mine.
No, that's right. I think they were excellent discussions with the council because, as you rightly point out, the issue of air quality in the valley is long-standing
Yes.
and is more than just about health impact. It's about the reputation of the valley. And the point of the presentation, I think we had agreed to run a subsequent forum, and ironically, that was a community forum was scheduled for in February. The point of that was that, certainly from my point of view, what we were seeing was a significant improvement in air quality in the valley, and that there should no longer be a stigma about that issue for people who are living there. And my experience in this role had been that there is an enormous and growing amount of interest in communities about the reputation of their communities as they relate to their environment. And we were particularly keen to work with the council to begin to turn around this quite understandable historic perception that it's a dirty place, that you've got coal dust on your washing or those sorts of issues, that it was a dirty industrial area, when in fact the evidence from the EPA's monitoring had shown dramatic improvements in air quality over the journey. A lot of hard work had been done, and that no longer should there be any stigma about air quality for this community.
Until February this year.
And that is, I suppose, one of the issues that irks people the most. That the irony was that here was a community that had worked hard, industrially and as a community, and is continuing to work very hard on its image as a place to live and raise your family. And one of the issues coming out of all of our work is how we use this incident to actually educate people further about what is the ongoing air quality issue there. We might talk about that further as the basis for our ongoing monitoring. There is, as well as health issues, we're very keen, or the EPA is very keen, to make sure that people are better informed about their air quality and that the community has an accurate perception of what it's like to live there.
Before we leave these discussions with the council raised with you at the first meeting something called the Latrobe Valley Air Monitoring Network. Now,
Yes.
what is that? There's just the one permanent monitoring station in Traralgon.
Yes.
What is this network?
Look, Dr. Torre will know more about it, but as I understand it, some of the emitters, the power stations, also have emissions monitoring facilities. I know there's one in Girralang that monitors, I think it's sulphur dioxide, but it could be other issues as well. And historically, there is another monitoring station somewhere else that they run, and historically there might have been others. So obviously some of the members of the council are well familiar with the history of air monitoring in the area, and they were querying those facilities.
Yes, and the message that they gave you was that they felt that it had fallen into disuse, was not what it once was, post-privatisation, and they were looking to the EPA to take the lead in re-establishing that network.
Okay. Look, I can't recall the exact discussion about that. I know that there are still facilities there that are monitoring in regard to that network, though.
Right. But the EPA's position at the end of this discussion was Traralgon is representative of air quality, at least in Morwell East, and so we don't see the need for another permanent monitoring station.
That's right.
Could I just ask, Mr. Merritt, in terms of your regulatory engagement with the mines and the power stations, do you require those operators to measure PM 2.5 or PM 10?
No, we don't. There are emission standards out of the chimney, but look, I'm standing corrected, but I don't think it specifically relates to the fine particle.
I mean, do you think that's something to consider for the future as part of, in essence, their responsibility?
It may well be considered. I come back to my earlier comment, though. As presented to me, the evidence of air quality in the valley, notwithstanding this event, is that we have seen a significant improvement in air quality in the area, and that I'm not sure that would warrant further monitoring, given that we've already got a station. We've tested that station against a 12-month program in Morwell and found them to be broadly similar. Look, I won't repeat it, but my concern is to work with the community to get a more accurate understanding of their air quality and to begin to champion the environment in the valley.
I suppose my point is about monitoring the potential source of these particulates at the source. Traralgon's a little way away, there's dilution occurring, but you don't actually know what's coming out of these operators.
I can't comment specifically on what we're monitoring out of the stacks at the moment, but there are monitoring of those emissions from the chimneys. I can find out what's being monitored.
It would be very interesting to know if there are any PM 2.5 or PM 10 readings during or just preceding the fire and the early stages of the fire.
Okay, I'm not aware that there are, though. No.
Right, now I'd like to move to February this year and the EPA's role in monitoring air quality in Morwell and elsewhere in the Latrobe Valley. Now, in terms of the timing of the EPA's involvement, the EPA was represented on the State Emergency Management Team throughout the incident, if I understood that correctly.
Yes.
And the State Emergency Management Team minutes will inform us who participated for the EPA.
Yes.
It wasn't you, I take it?
No, it wasn't.
No. From the 13th of February, when Commissioner Lapsley tells us he declared that the fire was also a hazmat incident, the EPA was a key support agency. Would you agree with that?
Our key support work began before the 13th.
Yes, and as you've told us, on the 11th of February, Dr. Torre was dispatched to Morwell to...
The decision was taken to
Yes.
send. He physically went down on the 12th, yes.
All right. Now, to get a picture of the monitoring that the EPA undertook, there's a very useful table that is part of Attachment 10, EPA Data Quality Management Plan. And it's on the last page, page 27 of that document. Sorry, we're just trying to get the document up on the screen.
I understand.
And it's page 27. So this identifies along the top the various substances that were being measured, and along the vertical axis down the left-hand side the various site names, and there's an indication of when each measure commenced. So if I've understood this correctly, the earliest measures came from the Morwell East automatic monitoring station.
Of the fine particles in the CO or anything?
Of anything.
The first measures were in relation to carbon monoxide, which, because our scientists there and our field officers had the handheld equipment.
Yes.
And that is likely to have been on the 13th years. And the dust track was installed on the 13th at Morwell South, and the equipment was fired up at the Morwell East station. Was starting to log data from there, I think, on the 13th and 14th.
Right.
The equipment was installed on the 12th, I think, and then commissioned over the next day or so.
All right. So we have data logging starting at Morwell East according to this table on the 12th. Perhaps because it was all averaged over a 24-hour period, the figures don't start until the 13th.
Yeah, there was an issue with, I did recall the report, there was an issue about the modem that sends the data from the station to our Centre for Environmental Science, which caused some delay in the data being available. It was switched on the 12th and was starting to send on the 13th and 14th.
All right. Now, to get the order of events straight, Dr. Torre arrived on the 12th. His first action was to begin recommissioning the box that was left at the Morwell East football ground that you've identified.
Perhaps it might be better if can I explain how that works? Okay. So the first action is we've already got the Torrelton monitoring station up and monitoring.
Yes.
Okay, so
but that's not much assistance in relation to fine particle measures or carbon monoxide in the southern parts of Morwell, is it?
But it'll be giving us readings for the valley.
Yes.
All right, and our scientists will be looking at satellite images as they do, and we'll be providing the forecasts, as we've done and always do, on smoke movement for that day based on weather forecasts. So before the fire has started, that work is being done. The role of Dr. Torre as the principal air quality expert is not to physically go and plug in the equipment and get it moving. He's there on the 12th assessing the situation. His team, or a team of probably 5 or 6 scientists and technicians, are working at our Centre for Environmental Science, preparing for what I call the interim equipment, which is Morwell East. So there's the immediate, which is dust track, put it in, plug it in. There's Morwell East, which is an in situ station that we hadn't fully decommissioned and were able to recommission. And they're also turning their mind to what other equipment we might have and might be able to use or source elsewhere. As the principal air quality expert, he is there working with the emergency services, making assessments of the situation, relaying back to the team back in Melbourne as to what we might need, what the situation might be.
All right, so when he came down on the 12th, and perhaps it would be best to ask him this tomorrow, did he bring with him mobile equipment that could be set up?
No, I don't think he had equipment with him. It was, again, within the EPA, we separate out the technicians who run and equip our stations and do that work, and the scientists who use that equipment as only one input to their work. They travelled down separately on the 12th, and they had with them the equipment for the Morwell East station, and then we sourced separately the handheld carbon monoxide monitoring and the more portable fine particle equipment that was subsequently set up at the bowling club.
All
in Morwell and south of Morwell.
The handheld carbon monoxide monitors, the fire services in fact had them, did they not?
No, I think you're referring to their... well, they would certainly have them, but we had some as well.
Right.
We used their equipment, their sort of portable monitoring units that are in place. We subsequently used those around the perimeter of the mine and in the town.
You've provided an appendix. Appendix 2, I think it's in the second volume, behind tab 82.
Sorry, Ms. Whittaker. Where is that in volume 2?
Behind tab 82.
Tab 82.
82 in the second volume, should be.
Week 2, volume 2. I'm looking at tabs 19 to 23.
May not be the correct volume.
Thank you.
So this is an appendix that lists the various air monitoring equipment that the EPA used throughout the fire, provides us with some photographs showing what it actually was, and then there are also some maps that I believe identify where the equipment was placed. But to get the chronology in order, you had the Traralgon station operating. It wasn't measuring PM 2.5, but it was measuring PM 10, and that provided some indicative data from the earliest stage. Have you provided us with the data from the Traralgon station from the 9th of February?
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Professor Catford and I couldn't find it attached to your statement, so can we ask that that be provided?
Of course.
We'll make a list and follow up. We don't expect you to remember this. And you would agree that the PM10 readings at Traralgon would be an indication, and the best indication that there was in the early days of the fire, of particulate levels in Morwell?
I hate to be pedantic about it, but our air quality scientists will also say that they rely also on visibility assessments.
Yes.
And so that's why their physical presence and the assessment that they're making is also an important input to that.
All right. Although those visibility readings won't have been logged and recorded in such a systematic way, will
No,
they?
of course, that's right.
All right, and then you had 2 beta attenuation monitors, which are specifically for measuring fine particles PM 2.5. The first of those was installed at Morwell East on the 12th of February, and the first data set was available from the 13th of February. And the second of those was installed at Morwell South on the 19th, with the first data set available from the 20th.
Excuse me, I found the appendix, and if one of our staff could pass this to Mr. Merridge. I think this is the appendix with the locations. You've got it, haven't you?
I've got that. All right. And you've provided us with a picture of what that actually involves, which is at image A.
That's the image of Morwell East.
Okay, so that's what we'll see if we go up to the football ground.
That's right.
Now, were there earlier readings or earlier data than the 19th, 20th of February for PM 2.5 in the southern parts of Morwell?
I understand that we had the piece of equipment. I'm trying to see if it's going to image the.
Was this the dust track?
It is the dust track. That's right. Which was installed at the bowling club on or around the 13th, and again is not comparable to the BAM, but provides information to the scientists to help them in their assessment of those fine particles.
All right. So the earliest data that you have about PM 2.5 levels in the southern parts of Morwell are from that dust track that was installed at the bowling club on the 13th of February.
Yes.
All right. And that will provide us with some data from the 13th to the 20th of February.
It does. There's as the scientists explained it to me, a form of hindcasting which seeks to make those readings convert to some form of data equivalent. So I'm not sure how those data or those numbers are comparable to the readings that are being produced from the more mainstream air quality station.
All right.
I'll leave that to them
I appreciate that it wasn't
Mm.
the same instrument
No.
doing exactly the same measurements, but that was the only data that was available for the south of Morwell prior to the 20th of February. Now, again, I don't think we've been provided with that data. Could you see that that data is provided to the inquiry? So this is the PM 2.5 data from the dust track located at Morwell South from the 13th of February.
I'm not sure in what form that comes, but certainly whatever's available, we've made available.
All right. And then carbon monoxide monitoring was undertaken by the make sure I've got this right, from an Ecotech carbon monoxide monitor. There was continuous monitoring that commenced at Morwell South on the 19th of February.
As part of the mobile laboratory there.
Right. Now, prior to that, there was data being collected, was there not, from handheld monitors?
And
other monitors. Yes. Now, again, what was the earliest that data started to be collected?
Well, they were taking readings, I think, on the 13th, and certainly the 14th, possibly the 13th, from the handheld spot checks around the town. And in addition, my understanding is on the 14th, CFA carbon monoxide monitoring equipment in the mine was relocated to the perimeter of the mine.
Around the perimeter, yes.
And then in the evening of the 15th and into the 16th, 4 of those monitors were moved into the southern part of Morwell to provide a makeshift network there to provide readings there.
All right. And that's the data that would be available about carbon monoxide levels until the mobile laboratory at Morwell South comes online on the 19th of February.
Yes.
Yes. So again, we've not been provided with that data, and I appreciate it's not the same quality as the data that comes from the mobile laboratory, but can you see that that's made available to the inquiry as well?
Yes.
Could I just ask about the purpose of this early monitoring, obviously, is to provide information for advising the Department of Health and so forth. So, I mean, it's not speculative. It's actually a vital part of the emergency response. That's right. And I think, in fact, in your statement, you actually say the validity was actually very good of these things.
As advised to me, I think the context, as you point out, is that certainly in those early readings before the weekend of the 15th and 16th, there was very little or no carbon monoxide being recorded by these handheld units, and that changed significantly on the weekend when the fire escalated. But it was about providing advice. The point I think we've made in the statement, and will no doubt come out again, is the view of the scientists that the principal area of concern was the fine particle monitoring, which you've alluded to as well.
Although the fire services were very much focused on carbon monoxide in those early stages. You'd agree with that?
Firefighters are always particularly concerned about carbon monoxide. They're absolutely up fighting the fire in an area where there's little airflow. But the experience of EPA scientists is that you would rarely see levels of carbon monoxide a distance from the fire, and that was what we were dealing with, part of a reflection of the unique nature of this event.
Yes. Now, before we leave this Appendix 2, there's one image I'd like to take you to. I think it's on the 9th page of the document. There's a spatial map.
Yes.
And it's the only one of these that I've seen attached to your statement, but it represents in a quite very helpful way. The number at the top is EPA.0008.001.009. Yes. And it's the map in the top left-hand corner. I think this is the only one of these that you've provided with your statement, but it's a very useful way of presenting the data. It shows the levels as they are distributed spatially. Were these maps produced regularly throughout the incident?
This is data from what's called the travel blanket.
Right.
If you look in my folder, you can see a picture immediately above it of a pipe sticking out of the window of the car and the screen on the dashboard.
Which looks nothing like a blanket, I have to say, but I had images of something quite different.
Yes, anyway. So this is a piece of equipment which is called a travel blanket, which is effectively a portable monitor for both carbon monoxide and the fine particles.
Right.
And you can see each of the dots is this vehicle being driven around the town, and it gives us, as you say, a profile of the dissipation of I think looking at this photo, the dissipation of the fine particles out there. So there are other images of it, and we were using it. Scientists were using it to get an understanding of how far the fine particles were travelling, what the dilution rate was into the community.
Could I say this is very helpful? It'd be nice to know what the key is, what red means and what green and blue means. And just to complete this question about giving us the data sets from the 13th of February for PM2.5, be helpful to know when you actually provided the first information to the Department of Health about levels of PM2.5.
Ms Richards, may I also seek clarification? Mr Merritt, so that you're collecting this data, and I think Professor Catford has articulated and you've agreed that you then provide it to the Department of Health. Why else were you collecting this data?
Well, principally to support the Department of Health and the incident management team. We had that service role under the emergency management plan to assist them. They're wanting to know. It's our requirement to make daily forecasts, or there was a requirement for us to make daily, and that became twice daily forecasts to help the community manage their lives during the situation and to help the emergency management team. So each morning, the scientists out back in Melbourne at our Centre for Environmental Science would analyse the data, the pollutant levels from the day before, look at the weather conditions, and look at how some of this smoke was acting and reacting in the town, and then make forecasts which became alerts that went out to the community about what they could expect in the day ahead in terms of when the smoke would be worse, when they could expect some relief.
Right, now before we leave this spatial representation, this is, as you've told us, the readings taken by the travel blanket as it drove around Morwell of, I think, fine particulate matter.
Yes.
Now, were these prepared on a daily basis, these images?
At least daily. Again, these were just additional inputs to the advice that we were providing to the Department of Health and Incident Control. My understanding was that, and I can't tell you what day this started, but my understanding was that the team were driving a fixed route around the suburbs and seeing how, in this case, what was happening to the dilution and dissipation of the fine particles.
All right, and there's another view, although it seems to be cut off at the bottom of that page, called a planning view.
That's a two-dimensional representation.
Yes, a two-dimensional representation. And I'm taking, I'm assuming that blue there's no reading, green there's a reading, but it's under whatever the trigger level was, and red there's a reading, but it's above the trigger level.
I think that's right.
Do these documents still exist? These maps generated from the travel blanket?
I believe they would. I'm not certain, but I believe they would.
Can we add to your list a set of these, both the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional views? And I think it was the 20th of February was the first time that the travel blanket started collecting data in Morwell. That would be very useful to have a spatial representation of where the fine particles were detected throughout Morwell. Thank you.
Say that even on a, if you like, a lay perception of that map that we can't get into full screen for some reason, it does correspond with an indication that that part of the area outside the mine, which is close to it, is very heavily impacted, and that fits in with other evidence, including the evidence given this afternoon of the schools that were in the area of red couldn't continue, and the areas of the blue, if you like, were able to continue. And so even from a very uneducated point of view, that travel blanket seems to give some very strong indications as to levels of concentration.
I drew the same conclusion. I was particularly interested in the level of dissipation. And the analogy that was put to me in regard to the very fine particles is that they are so fine. It's a bit like putting dye into water. Very intense at the centre, but dilutes very, very quickly away.
And it ties in, you've got another table that gives on a daily basis where the levels are on a graph with an indication of wind direction, and if you put those together, you're much more likely to be drawing reasonable inferences than speculating about what the result is or was likely to be on at that particular time, or at any particular time when the readings were being taken by this travel rig.
That's right. So as the event unfolded, you're right. The critical issue was wind direction. It was the most profound impact on the community there, and you'll no doubt in your discussions around the fire and when those smoke events were at their worst, you'll see we had the most disadvantageous weather patterns. In other periods, there were terrible periods for smaller periods during the day, and then improved later on in the day.
All right, well, we might go to that now. If we can return to Mr. Merritt's statement, there's a graph that you've provided to us at page 23 of your statement, just under paragraph 124. And these are the rolling 24-hour averages for PM 2.5 at Morwell South. It commences from the, it's a little difficult to see, but I think it's the 21st or the 22nd of February.
Mm-hmm.
And along the top, you've indicated the wind direction on particular days. And we can see very clearly that the spikes correspond with a southwesterly wind.
That's right.
And these are the readings taken of PM2.5 from the mobile laboratory at the Morwell South at the Bowling Club, from when it started recording or providing a full data set on the 22nd of February.
Yes.
And we've asked you to provide what data there is for
Before
south
that.
of Morwell before that date. But we can see that for most of the period, levels of PM 2.5 were above, and in some cases, many times above the advisory standard of 25 micrograms per cubic metre.
I wonder if I could just bring in a comment about the week preceding these data. And would it be reasonable to assume that actually the PM 2.5s were very high during that period as well?
There were 3 peak PM 2.5 periods, as I understood it. Clearly that first weekend of the fire, the 15th and the 16th, where conditions visually, as reported by the scientists as well as others, were terrible. There would have been, I would assume, very high peaks then. This period of the 21st and 22nd, which is represented here, and then later on the 26th and 27th. They were the 3 peaks. The reduction in those peaks, again, my opinion doesn't matter much, but I assume it related to the progressive success in controlling the fire.
And the gap there is really in the first week of the fire. And to that we have to turn, for information about what the particulate levels in the south of Morwell were in the first week of the fire, we have to turn to what data is available, and that will be from the dust track.
Some from the dust track,
from the
that's
13th
right.
of February, and whatever extrapolation we can make from the Traralgon readings.
Yes, and I think you'll be able to rely on the observations of the scientists from the 12th as well. What we'll find is, I think, well, as was reported in evidence last week, that dramatic escalation on the weekend of the 15th and the 16th with the unfavourable winds. And clearly that was anecdotally a very dramatic situation.
You were, of course, monitoring PM10s at Traralgon during this period, and
Yes.
you're going to provide the data, but from our inquiries, it seems as though the PM10s at Traralgon were very high on the 9th and 10th. And I'm not sure, and you don't disclose this in your statement, whether you actually submitted a smoke advisory during that period. I think the appendices talk about the first advisory appearing on the 13th, 12th or 13th, but I'm not sure if you actually issued any before that, based on the Traralgon findings.
I'll need to check, but my recollection was that we did issue a low-level smoke advisory earlier in the week. Sorry, I haven't got the date in front of me, whether it was the 11th or the 12th. It might have even been earlier than that.
Be very helpful. Just a final question. I mean, is it possible to ask your scientists to model, based on all the available information, what the PM 2.5s are likely to have been leading up to the 22nd, when we first get some accurate results?
I think it is possible.
I mean, I think we were very impressed with the CFA modelling capability of looking at how the fire spread and what it might have actually led to. I mean, do you have the capacity within EPA to do modelling of that nature?
I think that we do. Yes. Thank you.
And that's a matter that we might ask the scientists about tomorrow. Now, you've summarised at paragraph 125 what the graph shows, and we've remarked on the gap before the 22nd of February. And the existence of that gap really highlights an issue, does it not, about the importance of having equipment, apparatus that can be deployed rapidly in an emergency event to obtain the best readings that you can when you need them.
For an incident such as this, yes.
It appears from reading your statement and also Dr. Torres' statement that a fair bit of effort went into recommissioning the Morwell East site very rapidly, but that perhaps a higher priority would have been to get mobile equipment into the southern area of Morwell as quickly as could be done.
Look, my recollection is that we were working in 3 parallel streams of activity. Get the scientists down and get their observations, because the initial request was, I think, for scientific advice. And again, the history of the EPA's involvement in these matters has I think, with no exception I'm aware of, been to provide that scientific advice as being adequate for the event. At the same time, there was the sourcing of that temporary equipment, such as the dust track, and then mobilising Morwell East. They were done in parallel, and then the mind was turning to what else might we need closer to the fire front as well. So there was a lot of work being done in those streams, as well as, of course, using what we already had in place, so almost the 4 streams. But I think the point that you're alluding to is what was our preparedness to quickly mobilise around this, and our role had never been to quickly mobilise air monitoring equipment for an emergency of this nature. There was without precedent that we would have this sort of event of this sort of duration being the critical issue, that would warrant the mobilising that, the sort of the emergency readiness of mobile air monitoring equipment.
Well, you do have 2 mobile laboratories at your disposal, do you not?
We have 3.
3. And yet there was approximately a week between the commencement of data being recorded by the Morwell East site and the commencement of data being recorded by the mobile laboratory at the Morwell South site. And it was in Morwell South where the data was most needed, was it not?
We certainly needed data in Morwell South, yes.
Yes, more so than you needed it in Morwell East.
In terms of the severity of it, yes.
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 So what I'm trying to understand is the reason for that time lag. A mobile laboratory appears to be something that could be quickly deployed to the site of greatest need.
Yeah, no, that's not the case.
Why not?
The EPA has never been, well, certainly in recent time, I'm not sure how far back, has never been set up to provide an emergency air monitoring facility. The mobile laboratories that we use are used exactly the same way as we deployed that station into Morwell East, or if we, the same scenario in Francis Street in Yarraville over truck movement, or the Brooklyn scenario where the station remains. It's about looking at, exactly as you referred to in the State Environmental Protection Policy, a scenario where there is something other than just the broad-based population that warrants investigation. And we would never put because, again, as a layperson, the principal impact on air quality is weather. You know, you've got the source, but it's which way the wind is blowing, and therefore you would never deploy an air monitoring station for less than 12 months because you need the seasonal impact. So, I think you were touching on earlier, the decision about where this station would go is a critical issue for the scientists. Then there are issues around getting access to the site, getting power to the site, getting security to the site. These facilities were never contemplated to be hook it onto the car and drag it down to the valley and plug it in. That is just not what they were doing. Now, clearly out of this event, the question will be, well, should we have had that?
Yes.
That would require a level of foresight which had no historical basis. I think evidence has already been tendered.
Although the EPA is a support agency for emergencies, and one of its roles is to advise on air quality issues.
Yes, and that is done by deploying an air quality scientist to the scene who advises the emergency services. I'm not suggesting there's not lessons to be learned, but that is the situation that we deal with. We would be called out in that role several times a year, probably a few times already this year, for events involving emergency services who need air quality advice. I mean, those events are up and down in hours, if at the most 24 hours. And it's the advice of these scientists which is critical to these events. I understand the frustration about it took some time. Normally, there would be at least a month lead time before the decision to take some readings and to deploy a mobile laboratory. The people moved heaven and earth to get it there in the days that they did, and they did a great effort.
But the equipment that was most useful, taking the learning that you can from this experience, and was able to be deployed quickly, was the travel blanket?
It was a very useful piece of equipment, yes. Yes.
And the dust track.
And the dust trackers were useful.
And
yes.
also portable carbon monoxide
yes.
monitors.
Yes.
And those three things were able to be deployed very quickly.
Yes.
And with one of them, I think it was the dust track, the delay was getting it here from Tasmania.
No, that's the travel blanket.
That's the travel blanket,
yes.
all right. But in future, clearly it would be useful to have a greater reservoir of that kind of equipment to draw on for rapid deployment in an emergency.
Look, it's certainly one of the areas for examination now as to what should be available. I think you've already alluded, though, and you'll see in the data, the limitations on that equipment in terms of they're not a substitute for an air monitoring station that streams data, that provides that, but they are an adjunct to the scientists and the work that they're doing.
But as we agreed at the outset, in an emergency you have to get the best information you can when you need it. And those three pieces of equipment seem to be the best suited for getting in there early and getting some information at an early stage.
Yes. Yeah.
So could I just follow up then? So you don't actually have a travel blanket in Victoria?
No. It's a very useful tool in a Tasmanian setting because there's obviously a very heavy reliance on wood burning for heat, and they have particular climatic conditions and inversions which trap those conditions. So it's a tool that lends itself to providing a rapid report to the community in that sense. We don't have that circumstance here that we would have regular use for it, but it's, I think, as Council has pointed out, the cost effectiveness of those tools and the visual benefit it was able to provide was really useful as an adjunct to the scientists, and something we'll look very seriously, or the organisation would look seriously at in the future as having available.
Yeah, I would be reasonable to assume that a state the size of Victoria should have at least one travel blanket available for events like this, not least with climate change and increased burning off and bushfire risk.
It's a very practical tool to use.
So is there some sort of pooled agency arrangements where, an area can call up a facility like this quickly? Because even the travel blanket took, 10 days to arrive or whatever. It was a long period. It didn't get going until the 21st, 22nd. Yes. And you already had, action responses on the 13th of February.
Look, there is strong cooperation between the agencies. Again, the notion that it took 10 days to go implies, and I know you don't mean to do this, but can be seen to imply that the event that occurred on the 15th and 16th was what was occurring on the 9th and 10th. It was not. And I haven't read the exact transcript of last week, but this was an event, a mine fire in that first week, which, again, in my recollection, was not inconsistent with mine fires that had occurred previously, which I might have had no involvement from the Environmental Agency at all in them, because that was the nature of the emission. Once the escalation occurred, everything changed dramatically on that weekend, and a lot of work went into then rapidly escalating the gear. Fortunately, there was some foresight at the end of that week, but clearly things changed completely on the 15th and 16th.
I suppose the point I'm making is that your scientist, Dr. Torre, attended on the 12th. You put into process an action plan, which was commendable, and you're already moving equipment down on the 13th. The issue is, given the value of the travel blanket, whether an urgent call should be put out. And indeed, the question is, should Australia have reserve equipment like this, that if an event occurs anywhere in the country, there is a rapid response facility that this can be mobilised?
Look, and I do take your point. I won't over-comment on the travel blanket because I'm not that familiar with its precise application here. But look, it's a very useful piece of equipment. And the other point that you make is about what is the right custodian of the equipment so that it's accessible to the right agencies. And that's certainly one which has to be worked through now about after this event.
All right. Now, clearly the 15th and 16th is a date of significance for you, but to summarise the evidence that we heard last week, I think two propositions emerged pretty clearly. One is that from the very earliest days of the fire services understood that it would take at least a month to put out. And the second is that people were affected by smoke in Morwell from the outset.
Look, there was certainly... No, you're right. Coal fires take a long time to put out. That was certainly evident. But I'm surprised that I thought in the evidence that I'd seen, it had been consistently said that the matter escalated significantly on that first weekend.
Well, there was a particular issue about carbon monoxide levels in the southern parts of the town on the 15th and 16th.
Yes.
But I don't think it was suggested that there were not issues with smoke in Morwell from the commencement of the fire on the 9th.
I agree. There was smoke during that week, yes.
Just because it wasn't measured doesn't mean it wasn't there.
It was there, but again, the smoke levels, my understanding, were dramatically worse on the first weekend. The fire spread dramatically on that first weekend, I thought. And the weather conditions were particularly unfavourable.
Yes, they were. Now, just to finish off our discussion of recording of fine particulates, at paragraph 126, you say that there were measurements taken prior to the 19th of February on portable equipment, and we've asked you to ensure that that data is provided. Can I just be clear, was the data that was being recorded on portable equipment being provided to the Department of Health and the Chief Health Officer?
I don't know whether specific data was being provided or whether it was the scientists providing advice to the Department of Health.
So who do we ask to find out the answer to that question?
Dr. Torre should be able to answer whether he was one of the major scientists there located working with the Department of Health Officer.
And Dr. Lester also presumably will be able to tell us what she was receiving. And then at paragraph 127, you say that although the PM 2.5 concentrations were very high, they were not unusually high for a bushfire event. Is it usual during a bushfire event in or around the Latrobe Valley to record PM 2.5 levels as high as 500 micrograms?
I was just relaying the advice from the scientists in that regard.
All right. The second sentence, you say there have been several occasions when levels have been higher, and my question is higher than what? Higher than the highest reading or higher than the average?
Sorry, that was the advice I was getting from the team. I think they were, again, making the point in that the peculiar nature of this event, I think has been discussed earlier, was the duration of those high levels. Obviously a bushfire, by its nature, the fuel source is exhausted and there's not the sustained level of smoke.
Yes, and so while you might record high levels of PM 2.5s, it would only typically be over a matter of days, not a matter of weeks.
Or less, yes.
And that was an unusual feature of this event.
It was the significantly unusual feature of this event.
All right. I'd now like to move to carbon monoxide, which is obviously the other measure that was of concern throughout this incident. And again, you've provided us with one of these helpful graphs that correlates the wind direction and the carbon monoxide readings. This is below paragraph 133.
Yes.
And once again, these are the readings that were taken from Morwell South. They commence, as I read it, on the 21st of February. And they're the 8-hour averages. And of course, as we established earlier, the air quality standard in the State Environment Protection Policy is 9 parts per million over averaged over 8 hours. And we see there that there were a number of spikes when the carbon monoxide readings at the bowling club site exceeded that standard. And again, it correlates fairly closely with a southwesterly wind.
Yes.
Now, you've provided us with some commentary about this starting at paragraph 129 of your statement, and you refer at paragraph 130 to the carbon monoxide protocol that was developed during the incident. Now, am I right in supposing that questions about the content of that protocol are matters that we should direct to the scientists and to Dr. Lester?
Anything other than the generality of it, yes.
All right. Well, for a layperson like me, the obvious difference between the protocol and the state environment protection policy is that the trigger level that is adopted is 3 times. The trigger level adopted in the carbon monoxide protocol is 3 times that is prescribed in the state environment protection policy. Can you explain why that is?
In lay terms, my explanation
is
that the standards for air quality, whether they're particulate or carbon monoxide or others, are framed with regard to the epidemiological studies, which all relate to exposures over a 12-month or to health effects over a sustained duration of a year or more. So the standards work back from what number of exceedances would be healthy to experience if experienced in the course of 12 months, because that's where all the epidemiological studies relate to. There are there is evidence about very short, sharp impacts of carbon monoxide. Obviously, it can be fatal at very, very high concentrations, but there is little evidence about exposures in between that period, but that's the limit of my explanation of that.
All right. Well, looking at the state environment protection policy, it prescribes the standard of 9 parts per million over 8 hours, and then there is a goal within 10 years, maximum allowable exceedances of 1 day per year, which I understand to mean that the goal is that that standard of 9 parts per million should only be exceeded in 1 day per year. Have I understood that correctly?
Look, that's a reasonable understanding, but I would prefer that the scientists explain how that extrapolates out and how the formation of the protocol worked.
Yes, because this clearly is something that needs explanation, isn't it? Why is a carbon monoxide protocol adopted that uses a trigger point that's 3 times the state environment protection policy prescribed standard? And your lay understanding is that it relates to the duration of the exposure.
It relates to the epidemiological evidence that's out there about long-term exposure to these issues, but I'll defer to the health experts as to the formation of the protocol.
All right, now we had some evidence last week from Mr Katsikas, who was Deputy Incident Controller on the 15th and 16th of February, about carbon monoxide readings that were of concern to the incident controller. Did you have any involvement in the discussions that took place between the incident management team and Environment Protection Authority and Department of Health people on the 15th and 16th?
No.
No? Did Dr Torre?
I believe so. And
right.
Yes.
So it's to him we should direct questions to try to understand how that decision-making process unfolded on the 15th and 16th.
Him and perhaps others. It was the EPA and it was the Department of Health officers and the CFA who were involved in those discussions.
Now, the carbon monoxide protocol that that was developed and which you've provided with your statement, there was some peer review done on that carbon monoxide protocol. And again, the precise content of it is something probably more a matter for the scientists and the doctors than for you. But perhaps you can tell me what was done with the peer review once it was obtained.
We used the peer review. Perhaps I could go back. The EPA had established a science and engineering advisory committee as a group of eminent scientists. This precedes the fire, to act as a form of governance, if you like, over scientific decision making by the organisation. We saw it as a parallel to our risk and audit committee on other risk and finance issues. It was chaired by Dr. Stocker. And in the course of this process, we wanted to engage those peer review exercises and table them to the committee to help them exercise their questioning and challenging over the way in which the organisation was discharging its function in the intense situation that existed around this fire.
Yes, so there were 2 peer reviews obtained in relation to the carbon monoxide protocol. One from Professor Ross Anderson, who's an epidemiologist, and another from Dr. Faye Johnston, who's an environmental epidemiologist. And as I read them, they both query the appropriateness of the high levels that were adopted as trigger points in the carbon monoxide protocol. And perhaps from a management perspective, you could tell us how that query was fed back into the protocol and whether this information was shared with the Department of Health.
Look, I believe it was. I don't have the chain of that, but the protocol was, of course, owned by the Department of Health, and they had commissioned, I believe, a peer review as well. So I can't give evidence as to how that was passed to the Department of Health. I believe it was discussed with them.
All right. Can you tell us how or by whom and when?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
No. So are we safe in assuming that this peer review, these peer reviews that the EPA obtained were shared with the Department of Health?
Yes.
Because it was a shared protocol?
Yes. Well, the ownership of the protocol is by the department,
Right.
but we clearly contributed to the formation of it.
Now, there's one other measure that was recorded at levels of concern during the fires, and that was the volatile organic compound benzene. You addressed this at paragraph 138 of your statement. And the assessment criterion for benzene is 9 parts per billion, and there were 2 sampling locations where that exceeded the standard. One at the Maryvale Crescent Early Learning Centre, 9.2 parts per billion on one occasion. Can you tell us what the date was? And if you don't have it off pat, you can add that to the list.
Look, I don't have it at hand, but we'll find that.
And the other was the Morwell Bowling Club. There were 2 occasions on the 26th and 27th when concerning levels of benzene were recorded. And what did the EPA do with that information?
It was forwarded to the Department of Health.
To the Department of Health.
To ask a question about disclosing to the public the results of environmental monitoring, or what's the EPA's new policy about that?
Well, our practice was to put as much data as we had available to the community, but wherever we did, to provide some explanation and some commentary around that so as to make it useful. And on issues such as that, where there were health issues around it, there was a Department of Health commentary as well.
I mean, some information we've received was that there was an inordinate delay in providing the results of those benzene levels. I mean, was that consistent with your policy?
Well, there wasn't so much a delay in putting. Well, the process of monitoring those compounds and then the analysis of it is quite slow. The working then, that information was forwarded to the Department of Health for assessment. I can't comment on the delay in that coming in. But it was not our policy to delay it, but it was our position to, wherever possible, make sure there was some informed commentary about the data so that people weren't left with just raw numbers to analyse themselves. I think, as I've made the point earlier in the statement, there were some matters for which there were available standards to compare it against and some that there weren't. And so the aim was to try and make it as useful as possible.
Now, we've been focusing very much on air quality. I just want to touch on water testing. There was a range of testing of water quality that was done, and you relate this starting at paragraph 141. The one thing that I'd like to ask you about is there was some testing undertaken of a water tank in Willis Street, which is, of course, close to the mine, on 4 separate occasions. Are you able to identify where the results of that testing will be found?
We'll be able to access those results.
Right.
Yes.
Could you please add that to the list?
Sure.
And then you say you ceased, or the EPA ceased that sampling when advised by the Department of Health that it was unnecessary. Did the Department of Health provide a reason for that testing not being necessary?
I'm not aware of what the discussion was around that decision.
I take it that extends to the doing of it generally, because a number of the submissions have referred to concerns of residents with water and when they should use water from a tank and water from other sources. There was just a general unease indicated through the submissions.
There was a lot of unease in the second week of the fire about ash,
Yes.
and then either ash playing in it, breathing in it, or ash in the water. We tested the ash in that second week and published those results at the end of the second week, I think on the 21st, to try and allay some of that concern. Some of that helped and some didn't.
You can't recall what the results of that water testing revealed?
I can only recall the advice that that was not an issue of concern, which was consistent with the advice from the ash results themselves.
I think you can take that last item off your list. We have identified the water sampling data. You've already provided it, and it's at tab 19. And it includes in the last column residential water tank at Willis Street. We asked you to identify whether there are any technical difficulties experienced in the monitoring from the 9th of February, and you've identified a number of these, starting at paragraph 154.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't go through each of these. There's just a couple of them I'd like to highlight in discussion with you this morning. At paragraph A, you identify a number of technical challenges that cumulatively resulted in a delay in having access to the full set of data. And again, I suggest to you that this perhaps highlights the need to have some equipment available for rapid deployment in an emergency situation. And then the last item that you highlight is some early difficulties with the transfer of carbon monoxide data from the CFA to the EPA.
Yes.
How was that managed?
When those area rays, as they are called, when they are established and feeding into the base station at the police station at Hazelwood Road, I understand from our staff it was very labour intensive to download the data off the central hub and then translate that into tabular form. It was just a very physically time-consuming, demanding piece of work until such time as the mobile laboratory was up, and it does that somewhat seamlessly.
And in the last sentence you say, for any future application, more appropriate arrangements will be made with CFA. What would those more appropriate arrangements be?
Oh, look, clearly the way in which this network was being formed for the carbon monoxide was being established by people in real time. And I think the advice from some of our staff is that we were trying to make equipment work in a way for which it wasn't specifically designed. I mean, this equipment is used by the emergency services at the scene of an emergency fire, which will be up and down again in hours, possibly 24 hours. And here we were trying to create that data from 4 different sources into a network which gave us a reading on that area. So the question will be, in working after this event, can that equipment be better used or more better configured to be able to do that, or is it fundamentally unsuitable for it, and is there something else that might do that task better in the future?
And as you sit there today, you don't have the answers for that.
No.
You've just identified that that's an area that needs improvement. And again, it comes back to having the suite of equipment that can be deployed rapidly in an emergency event.
Yeah, look, we'll no doubt come to this point again, but the issue which we'll be weighing around this is, what is the likelihood of an event of this nature occurring, given our experience of it, and what's the appropriate level of preparedness that balances out those needs. I think that's where the debate around this equipment, because clearly carbon monoxide is such a mainstream issue for firefighting, and the technology, like everything else, is improving all the time. Is there something else that we can be working with them on that might better enable us to set up such a network again in the future?
And the other one I wanted to ask you a little more about was paragraph 160. You've identified that laboratory access was an issue.
Yes.
And I take it this was not so much an issue with air quality as with the soil and water and ash samples.
On the smoke samples too, the earlier reference to the delay in the benzene result. One of our learnings from it is to make sure that our relationships and/or contracts with external laboratories are appropriately configured to provide for absolutely priority testing and 24-hour access for these events.
And also having more than one laboratory to call on in an emergency situation.
Indeed, yes.
Looking to the future, we asked you to state what environmental monitoring the EPA proposed to undertake in the Latrobe Valley in future. And you've already given us one answer, which is to to add PM 2.5 monitoring to the Traralgon fixed station. And then you tell us that the mobile laboratory that is set up at Morwell South at the bowling club will continue for 12 months. Why 12 months?
It'll be at least 12 months. Again, we're looking for another 12-month cycle. All of our laboratories run for a year in order to make sure the seasonal aspects are incorporated into the results. Whether it continues beyond that point will depend entirely on what the results are, much as we took the original decision about. If it's showing results that are consistent with the Traralgon result, there'll be arguably not much point in keeping it there. If it's showing anything different, then the station needs to remain.
All right, so it's a similar process to the one you went through with the Morwell East site. It was there for 12 months. You found no appreciable difference between it and the Traralgon site, so it was removed with a decision to upgrade the Traralgon site to detect an additional measure. And again, there'll be a comparison between the Morwell South mobile laboratory and the Traralgon site principally.
Yes.
And if there's any detectable difference, then there'll be a consideration of whether to put something more permanent on the site.
That's right, because there are in resourcing again at the time there were really the two considerations. One is that there's going to be some form of long-term health study go on in this area, and therefore longer-term data will be important to support that. But there's the other issue, which I alluded to earlier, which is the community's confidence in the air that it's breathing. And that'll be a really significant issue, I think, We know that communities do draw confidence from the presence of these stations in their vicinity. If it serves that purpose, and in discussion with the council, we'll try and come to what's the best result. But at this stage, we're just committed for the 12 months as we do for any monitoring regime.
Sorry, I'm slightly confused. So will it continue in Morwell South or Morwell East? Both.
We're committed to keep it there for the 12 months and committed to both of them to consider the results and make any judgment based on those results.
Just a final point. Surely part of the function is to be an early warning system. The fact that you don't detect something isn't a reason to get rid of a monitoring station. I mean, if you're watching out for tsunamis, I mean, you're pleased if there aren't any, but you have a facility to pick them up when they occur.
Look, the forecasting facility, I suppose it's rather than early monitoring, is a function that we've been using both our Traralgon station and the satellite imagery around. I'd be relying on the scientific advice as to whether that was adequate or whether supplementing in the future.
Just bear with me a moment. Can I move now to the issue of communications, which you cover starting at paragraph 184 on page 37 of your statement. Can you give the board an overall understanding of how the EPA's communications strategy developed during this incident?
I suppose the context for our work, certainly up until the 18th of February, was that we were providing information to the Control Centre and the Department of Health to allow them to make any decisions that needed to be made, and we were following the bushfire protocol and issuing the advisories that reflected that protocol with the message from the Chief Health Officer embedded in those. So that was the work that we did. It was evident, having myself and the Chairman of the EPA and our directors and several of our staff were present at the community meeting on Tuesday, the evening of the 18th of February.
And that was coincidental, wasn't it? Weren't you here to have one of your regular meetings with the council that you'd agreed to
no,
have?
It wasn't a council meeting. We were there to have a community forum.
Community forum.
So one of the we were doing community forums around the state, and part of our discussions with council last year was that we'd envisaged doing a forum with the community where we'd have a chance to talk about air quality and have our scientists there. So that's why we were there in the town. But given the events of the previous weekend,
the discussion was different from the one you'd planned.
It certainly was. It wasn't so different at our forum, but obviously it was very different at the public forum at Kennett Hall that evening. And there was a lot of criticism levelled by different people from different angles, but in summation, there was a lack of satisfaction with the information that was being provided and how it was being provided. There was, and it was from that we decided to ramp up our individual efforts to communicate more. So that took the form of, there was some criticism about trying to find data on our website, and we built a microsite and launched that later in the week.
Yes.
We continue to issue the advisories, and I think we issued 60 odd of them over the period. We started doing more social media, and I think I tweeted 70 or 80 times. It was a large volume of information there. And we, more importantly, started to participate in the media conferences that occurred almost every day from then for the next month or so. And that was partly my role, to participate in those. So we were trying to hit all of those different channels. In addition to the staff that we had who were working in the Regional Control Centre, we started to mobilise other staff from the organisation. And I think in the course of the event, about 80 of our staff came down and were present at the respite centre. They were on the CFA bus. They were standing on the street corners as part of that work. They were in the support centres trying to provide information each day to people, to meet those who didn't have access to internet or weren't so mobile. We just started to, like everybody I think did in that week, hit every channel that we could to get more information to people.
And was this guided by the state level communications and stakeholder engagement strategy?
Yes, so we were a participant in the MJ PIC.
Yes. We've now learned what that stands for. All right. Now, at paragraph 184B, you talk about smoke advisories that were issued in conjunction with the Chief Health Officer. And you've provided us, I think, with a full suite of the full set of these attached to your statement. Now, there's just one that I'd like to take you to. It's in the second volume, and I think we've got the right second volume for you now, behind tab 122. So that's a high-level smoke advisory for 17:45 on Friday the 28th of February. We're both looking at the same document?
Yes.
Now, other evidence tells us that it was on this afternoon that Dr. Lester provided advice to those in vulnerable groups, children, the elderly, those with pre-existing respiratory and cardiac conditions, to temporarily relocate from the south of Morwell. I don't see that reflected in this high-level smoke advisory, and nor do I see it in the advisory from the following day.
Okay.
Can you explain that inconsistency between the advice provided by the EPA and the advice provided by the Chief Health Officer on the 28th of February?
Well, I take your point that it doesn't reference the advice. Clearly, the decision by and the announcement by the Chief Health Officer that afternoon on Friday the 28th was specifically aimed at the vulnerable groups living in the southern part of Morwell. We were issuing advisories for the entire Valley community at the time, and the message is relevant to them, but I take your point.
Yes.
It would have been better to incorporate that other advice.
This high-level smoke advisory is in a standard format, isn't it?
It is. It's consistent with the protocol message.
And the quotes from Dr. Lester are not quotes that she gives you every time you provide a high-level or a low-level smoke advisory. They're predetermined, are they not?
They're part of the protocol, yes.
And it would have been more helpful for the community if these, the smoke advisories between the 28th of February and the 17th of March, when her advice altered, had incorporated her actual advice to vulnerable members of the community.
I think that's a fair point.
But moving forward again, and we're nearly at the end, you provided some information about the EPA's role in actually regulating the power station and the mine, which is a quite separate exercise from the one we've just been discussing. So the power station is licensed, as I understand it?
Yes, it is.
And there is some monitoring associated with that licence?
Yeah, there are two specific emissions. One is emissions from the stacks of the station, and the other is the discharge from the ash ponds.
All right. So there's no monitoring of unplanned discharges such as we experienced in February and March of this year?
No.
The very last question that we asked you is whether the EPA has taken or is considering taking any compliance action against GDF Sewers, the occupier of the mine, in relation to emissions from the fires. And the answer to one part of that question is yes, there is an investigation, and consistent with the police's approach and WorkSafe's approach, you're not sharing details of that with the inquiry. But one compliance measure that can be taken short of a prosecution is the serving of a clean-up notice, is it not?
Yes.
Can you just explain to the inquiry what a clean-up notice involves?
It's simply the capacity of the regulator to require a premise to make good whatever environmental damage it's done in regard to its local space.
Yes. And at one level, this was a massive pollution event, was it not?
Prima facie, it is a major pollution event, yes.
Yes, and looking at the range of remedies and enforcement tools available to the EPA, clean-up notices may have been an appropriate measure to take against the mine operator in this instance.
Yeah, the advice that I received was that the test that would be applied in regard to the clean-up notice would be similar to that being applied in the investigation and broader breach. And so the recommendation was not to separate those two actions.
All right. And the opportunity to serve a clean-up notice has now passed, has it not?
It has, yes.
People have done their own cleaning up.
They have.
You say in the last sentence that the options for statutory measures, including a clean-up notice, were not considered practical.
No.
Why not?
Well, again, I think the advice to me was that the test that would be required to defend that clean-up notice, assuming it would be challenged, would see us preempting the investigation into the prima facie pollution event.
I understand that. Thank you, Mr. Merritt. I've no further questions for you. Do members of the board have any further questions?
Thank you. I'd like to address a couple of issues. Just on the regulatory environment, I mean, how close do you think people should live to an open coal mine?
Well, no, that's a very difficult question for me to answer, particularly with any professional capacity. Certainly what we have in Morwell is a situation that requires serious management, given the proximity of those people, particularly along Wells Street, to the northern batter of the mine. But I don't have a professional view as to what an appropriate distance would be.
So clearly this is a community very close to the mine that's had a long legacy of environmental health issues, and you think of the asbestos mesothelioma dimension. I mean, this is not something that's come out of the blue. They've had a legacy of challenges like this. So the communications strategy would really need to be pretty tailored to the needs of this community. Would you agree with that?
It is, yes, it does require and did require more specific strategies for the community that Morwell and the broader valley, yes.
And of course, one of the new developments that's occurred in the last few years is the use of social media. So you mentioned you had engaged a little in that, but particularly this first week when things were frankly going crazy, I mean, were you engaged in monitoring the social media, adding information and clarity to the discussions that were being posted?
Yeah. Again, it was not my recollection that things were going crazy in that first week. It was that dramatic escalation on that first weekend which led to a much more heightened group. We had officers attend the first public meeting on Friday the 14th at Kennett Hall, and the feedback from that was, whilst there were tensions, it was nothing like we saw subsequently on the 18th. And I attribute that to the shocking conditions that the community experienced on the 15th and 16th. On the broader issue of use of social media and other issues, it's an area for a lot of reflection after as to how we work with this community. I think as you're alluding to, the challenge that we faced in communicating with the community were many. Not the least of which is, I'm not sure it's one community, there are many different groups there, some of whom have got an enormous knowledge about coal and burning it, having done so for their entire working lives. There are other parts of the community, it's an older community, and so access to technology was an issue there, but I think we recorded 120-odd thousand hits on our website throughout that period, 14,000 in one day. So, again, for that group, the issue is then what information was provided and what level of guidance around that, and I think that's a lot of work to be done there. It's an area for a lot of reflection post this event.
And certainly the submissions we received suggest that the communication was getting way ahead of you and other agencies in terms of the discussions within the community, particularly on social media. And the question is really, what capacity did your communications group have to track, follow, and indeed intervene in those discussions?
Look, we did track and follow social media. That wasn't a challenge. We had a social media officer whose job it was to do that and to feed information to us. So that wasn't the bigger challenge. I thought the more mainstream challenge was, I think, as was said in evidence last week, the desire, I think, logically, to have one issue, one source, particularly on sensitive issues of health. And there was a commitment to do that, and we tried to hold to that message. The feedback, and as you've seen, is that for many people that was not adequate. Now, whether it was not adequate because people didn't trust that message and were looking for verification under it, we certainly felt that, and that's why we ended up putting so much data in real time through to the microsite, because there was a really strong need from some in the community for verification. They just did not accept one message, one source. They didn't believe the source. There appeared to be some satisfaction in seeing the numbers that underpin that, but again, as Richards has alluded to, there's confusion in those numbers because we're reporting against standards and showing peaks above them, and people can't be expected to interpret that. So again, that takes you back to the one message, one source, and that message was not being received well when people are suffering in terms of eyes, throats, and particularly they're under enormous pressure if they're caring for people. If they're caring for children, particularly if they've got some vulnerability, if they're caring for older adults, those people felt under enormous pressure and lacked the trust in us to accept what was being said.
So, I very much accept what you're saying. So, what sort of proactive steps were you taking to really engage with this community and understand where their concerns were? It's all very well issuing smoke advisories, but, did you have your finger on their pulse?
Well, as I said, we had at various times some 80 of our staff rotated through the work, 80 out of 136 staff, so we've got an office permanently in the valley based in Traralgon.
But they weren't in Morwell, though. They were
they were out of there and moving through the streets of Morwell. We were at places like the Respite Centre every day. We were on the CFA bus. I felt nearly all of the time we were moving through those streets, and they were bringing feedback to us, and some of that is captured in my statement. There was a frustration with us that we weren't giving enough health message because we were the EPA. There was frustration at the message not matching their experience. And then there was a whole raft of other issues that came about, which you picked up on in your submissions as well.
So in retrospect, and you're moving on from the EPA, what more could have been done in terms of the public communications and that community engagement strategy?
I've seen reference, and I can't recall the precise reports, but there was reference made on one or other occasions to the concept of trusted sources. That if we accept there are issues about taking messages from government and government employees in these situations, that's not a situation that's unique to the Valley or Victoria or indeed the developed world. That a lot of work appears to have been done in establishing trusted sources within the community who can be given significant amounts of background information, who people will then listen to and be able to seek more assurance. And I think I saw in one of the reports a discussion around that, and that appears to be a contemporary trend in preparing and equipping communities for emergencies.
So were you able to follow through on that?
Well, not during the fire, we weren't, and we tried. But it was not something that was able to be worked up during the heat. In fact, I don't know that anyone ever identified who those trusted sources were in the community, and clearly in the midst of an emergency, it's too late to do that. That work needs to be done long before we find ourselves in the situation that we in this community did in February 2014.
Of course, this is not a new concept, because the white paper on emergency management in Victoria that came out at the end of 2013 talked about all this sort of issue about effective local communication, strong engagement, using the networks. But it seems 3-4 months later we weren't following through on that.
No, that's true. Well, we certainly didn't have those networks in place. I think the volumes show that most communication mediums were exhausted, but they weren't enough. They weren't enough.
Thank you.
Before I sit down, let Dr Wilson have a turn. I should tender those notes that the Council has provided of those meetings in April and September 2013. It's been suggested that I tender them as Exhibit 31, so we seem to have skipped a number.
31 was Mr Kelly.
Was 31 Mr Kelly? We might have skipped a number. So let's
Because
say
I had
Exhibit
30
33.
is Tracy Lund,
Yes.
31 is Kelly,
Yes.
he came after her, 32 is Merritt, and
If 33 could be these notes.
33.
The two sets of notes.
So I'll
Thank
just
you.
put that as Latrobe City Council notes.
Of meetings with the EPA Victoria on the 8th of April 2013 and the 2nd of September 2013. Now,
you.
Dr Wilson has some questions for you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Mr Merritt, is it fair to say that prior to 9 February 2014 there was no prior experience here or elsewhere around the world of an incident involving a brown coal mine fire burning for so long and impacting a community in the way this fire did?
That's correct.
So for all the wrong reasons, this particular mine fire was the world's first in terms of prolonged adverse air quality. Do you agree with that?
That's correct.
But the short point is there was no precedent on which to draw by which EPA could be guided in terms of its work prior to this fire.
No, in fact, previous fires had led us perhaps into a false sense of the impact of the mine fire on the town.
Professor Catford asked you about monitoring and preventative measures taken by EPA prior to the fire in and around the vicinity of Morwell. Is it fair to say that the smokestacks of the power station are filtered, as best you know?
Yes, they have precipitators on them.
Indeed, EPA insists on the filtration of those, the byproduct of which is ash taken to the Hazelwood ash retention area.
The ash pond, yes.
Right. Now, going back to your timeline, we'll develop this in a bit more detail in a moment, but Dr Torre arrived in Morwell on the 12th of February. Do you recall that?
Yes.
He will say that prior to his departure for Morwell, he arranged for a dust track and a travel blanket to be sourced from Tasmania. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yeah, we made contact with Tasmania early on.
But nevertheless, that accords with your recollection of the events? You're asked about the desirability of the introduction of national standards in respect of PM 2.5. Do you recall being asked about that?
Yes.
Is it your evidence that the EPA Victoria, anyway, supports the introduction of national standards?
Yes, we do.
Whether such standards are in fact introduced depends on an array of issues beyond your control and those of the EPA.
That's right. We're one participant in that process.
Your witness statement, long and detailed as it is, contains a number of dates and events, but may we draw from it a couple of key dates, and would you mind walking me through those? Mm-hmm. On the 11th of February, the EPA received a request to become involved, is that right?
It was a request for additional assistance, yes.
That was on the 11th?
Yes.
And you allocated about 10 people to the task on that date?
Yes, there was, in addition to the principal expert, there was a team of technicians and also staff from our Traralgon office.
On and from that day, EPA began issuing smoke advisory notifications, is that right?
That's right.
The next day, 12 February, handheld monitors were being used by CFA and MFB personnel on site. Have I got that right?
I'm not aware of what they were doing on site, but you mean they would have been, yes.
On that date, logging at East Morwell commenced.
East Morwell was commissioned and was gathering data. Yes.
On that day, dust track was accessed.
Yes, that's correct.
And as we mentioned before, on that day, Dr. Torre arrived. Is that right?
That's right, on the 12th.
On the 13th, the EPA got its first 24-hour reading.
From the dust track in Morwell?
Yes.
Look, my understanding was the 14th was the first 24-hour reading.
Okay, well, we'll move to the 14th. On that day, EPA began transmitting reliable data.
Yes.
And from that day, you engaged in the one source, one message concept.
Well, we had been engaging in that throughout, yes.
Throughout, from the 11th?
From the 11th, and in fact throughout the bushfire season, but throughout this we maintained that work.
On the 15th, fire escalated due to unfavourable winds, resulting in a watch and act being promulgated, is that right?
That's right, by the CFO.
And on the 15th, you also deployed monitors into the main streets of Morwell. Have I got that
We
date
began
right?
using those CO monitors into the network in the streets in the south of Morwell.
On the 18th, the MoLab arrived.
Yes.
A public meeting was held, is that right?
That night, yes.
And on and from the 18th, you had a change of the communication strategy that you adopted to reflect the information given to you by the public at the meeting.
Yes, we significantly increased that.
On the 21st and the 22nd, another spike in adverse weather conditions took place with prevailing winds from the southwest.
That's correct.
But on the 3 days that then followed, 23, 24 and 25 February, the fire receded.
The air quality conditions improved. Rather than being constant throughout that day, there were patches during the days and patches of respite.
On the 26th, another spike in adverse conditions occurred with southwesterly winds, is that right?
Yes.
Leading again to the presence of a deteriorated air quality.
That's right.
Then on the 28th, that is to say 2 days later, beyond the 26th, the CHO gave the relocation advice.
That's right.
Every day between 11 Feb and 28 Feb, is it correct to say that you and the Chief Health Officer were in touch on a day-to-day basis about matters of public health?
Yes, I'm not sure that was every single day, but it felt like every day.
It was suggested that it took a little bit of time to enliven the MoLabs. Do you remember being questioned about that?
I do.
Now, I may have not heard you correctly, but did you say that there were 3 only on which to draw?
We do have 3 of them. One is currently deployed in Brooklyn, so it wasn't available to be used.
Even if you had resourced all 3, the net effect of that, obviously enough, would not have altered the air quality that you measured. It just would have meant that you got readings from an additional number of locations.
That's right.
And even then, you couldn't be sure that the air quality that you measured at those different locations would be markedly different, one to the other.
No.
You agree with me, in other words?
I do, yes.
While it's true that the MoLab may not be a substitute for air monitoring stations, did the time in getting the MoLab to site adversely affect your ability to provide its response and its support?
No, I don't believe it did. And we were reliant, as we always are, on the technical knowledge of our scientists and their observations and other equipment to play our support role in the emergency management plan.
Is that another way of saying you couldn't have done anything different any quicker?
I don't believe we could have acted any faster than we did.
Yeah. Before I sit down, may I indicate to the board that our learned friends have asked for 3 documents. According to our records, they've already been supplied, but nevertheless we'll speak to our friends over the luncheon break to make sure that they have what they need. Thank you, Mr. Merritt.
Mr. Merritt, who notified you on the 11th of February and requested assistance?
The request came through the SEMT. Our officer there at the time on the phone was Liz Radcliffe, and she then advised Chris Webb, who brought that information to me, and we convened our executive management team as we are required to do under our emergency management protocol.
And the request was for data monitoring?
I think the initial request was for technical advice.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Redland?
And I don't have anything for this witness.
Thank you, Mr. Yes.
Just one question arising out of what Dr. Wilson asked you. Dr. Wilson put to you that quicker deployment of the mobile laboratory to South Morwell would not have changed the actual air quality. It would have given you a stream of data at an earlier point. It is the case, however, that the air quality readings as between South Morwell and East Morwell were markedly different.
Yes.
Readings of both carbon monoxide and fine particulate matter were much higher in the south of Morwell than they were at the Hourigan Road site, were they not?
Yes.
And it would have been of assistance to have better quality data being recorded automatically in the south of Morwell at an earlier stage.
I think the question related to did it compromise our ability to advise the incident control. I don't think it did. We were better assisted by having the station because the station has the ability to stream the data into our Centre for Environmental Science, so it's much more efficient. But the advice from the scientists was that they didn't feel compromised without it.
All right, and we've identified the sources of data that were available, and we'll try to identify exactly where those are prior to those automatic stations coming online. Thank you. May Mr. Merritt be excused?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Merritt. You're excused. We adjourn now till 2. Do you...
Yes, and we have Simon Ellis as a community witness after lunch.
Say
Can I
something?
just take a couple of minutes just to hand up
Yes.
the maps that
You
you may
I promised
recall.
on Friday.
What's been prepared, some A3 maps with the positions marked. We've also produced some A1 maps which are obviously larger and therefore a bit easier to see but will not be as convenient for the purposes when you're in the inquiry. We have some display maps available as well. We'll just at this stage wait till somebody says that they'd like to see those, but plain enough I thought I'd give those to you now in case there's anything there that you're able to observe, but it should show the licence area and all of the items that were mentioned.
Yes, well, at this stage, all I plan to do is to hand them over for recording purposes, and we'll have some further discussion as appropriate. Do you want to...
I'm advised by Mr. Reardon and those who instruct him that a PDF file will also be made available, and we've suggested that perhaps we could have a mural on the wall too, but we'll leave that to them. But there will be a PDF file available.
Yes, well, at the moment, it will be necessary to process them before we can have them viewable. Yes.
After lunch...
Do you want to have that recorded as a separate exhibit?
Perhaps we could, yes.
Yes, well, then those maps will be exhibit 34. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Simon Ellis, who was involved in establishing Voices of the Valley, will be the community witness after lunch. And then we have Mr. Poll from the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Yes, we'll resume at 2 o'clock.